We're fortunate this week on Every Church of Peace Church. We have Jim Wallis with us. When it comes to those people that are really thinking in America and talking about real change, a real voice is here. And we have a chance to talk with him and to deal with his latest book as well as general discussion. In fact, speaking of writing, he has been doing that for years and years. His columns, his articles, books, etc. But Sojourners Magazine is sort of his home base, which sort of keeps many people who are concerned, many ministers as well as serious lay people, concerned about the issues that really face us every day. And we are fortunate enough to have him here to discuss his newest book, God's Politics. And the title just brings out so much for us. It's this subtitle that makes a good starting place to begin to deal, all right, and made it possible for many people to think twice and pick it up. It's how the left does not get it, and the right does not get it right, is the way I'd love to say it, right? But it's that it, huh? That's what makes people pull it off of the bookstore shelves. They're wondering what this it is. What is it that the left does not get, huh? And the right doesn't?
Well, first of all, to be here with one of my heroes is a great treat and honor for me. So just to see you is a great blessing. Well, why the right gets it wrong is they're very comfortable with the language of church and values and faith and God. So much so, sometimes it feels like they think they own the territory, maybe own religion, own faith, own God. But then they narrow everything to one or two issues. The only moral values issues, they seem to say, are abortion and gay marriage. Now, these are important issues that need a good, better, deeper moral conversation on all sides. But my goodness, I'm an evangelical Christian. I find 3,000 verses in the Bible on poor people, rich, poor. So I insist fighting poverty is a moral values issue too. Protecting the environment, otherwise known as God's creation, is a moral values issue too. And the ethics of war, and this is why this show is important, the ethics of war, whether to go to war, when to go to war, how to go to war, and whether you tell the truth about going to war. This is a religious matter. And the left, they seem to forget what it wasn't very many decades ago when the Democrats were tied vitally to a civil rights movement led by black churches.
That's exactly right.
How has that been forgotten? You know, where would we be if the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and C.T. Vivian had kept their faith to themselves? Where would we be? So the left has gotten this confused idea that the separation of church and state means the segregation of moral values from public life or the banishing of religious language in the public square. And I think that's a big mistake because they've conceded the territory to the right. And the right then defines it in a very partisan, narrow way.
You know, basic to this conversation around this idea as we have it in the public is that so many ministers of the right really think of that it's personal, that religion is a personal thing, only personal. Huh? And that if you bring up any social issue, that it has no relevance to their religion, right? Is the and it seems like on the left you have exactly the opposite, right? Is the that we talk definitely about the social issues and take it for granted that they're related to spiritual life, to ethical life, and that there can't be any real religion if you do not deal with them. You know, it's this separation.
Yeah, and it's so confusing because the left forgets its own progressive history. I mean, every major social reform movement in America's history abolition of slavery and women's suffrage and child labor law reform, most famously civil rights, was led, driven in large part by religion and faith.
That's exactly
Never
right.
just people of faith,
That's
never,
right.
because religion doesn't have a monopoly on morality. That's got to be said. But always the role of progressive prophetic faith was very, very clear. So we have to get back to remembering that moral vocabulary. You know, I had this incident when I was a kid in my little white church in Detroit, Michigan. I was asking questions, you know, as a 14-year-old, why do we live the way in white Detroit and life is so different in black Detroit? And that got me into a lot of trouble asking those questions. One day an elder said to me, he said, Jim, he said, Christianity has nothing to do with racism. That's political. Political, you see? Our faith is personal. And I left that night. I couldn't push the questions down anymore and joined the civil rights movement and became a kid in one of your foot soldiers. And you know, I didn't have words to go around that then, but I do now, which is that the chapter in the book says this: God is personal, but never private. Never private. This God wants a relationship with us. Why? To sign us up for God's purposes in the world. It's never just me and the Lord.
That's right.
You know, it's what does God want? What breaks God's heart in the world, and what do we become a part of when we become? And I often talk about Charles Finney, the evangelist of the 19th century, evangelicals. He invented the altar call, and the reason why is he wanted to sign his converts up for the anti-slavery campaign.
Is that right?
Yeah,
No, I didn't know.
That was the original purpose of the altar call, was to sign up all these converts, get their names, he wanted their names, for the anti-slavery campaign.
Right.
What a powerful history that is.
That's right, it is. It's true. See, is that when you said that, it reminded me how I, too, came to begin to understand, because not all the black church for all times had been socially driven, right?
No.
Is that we had a better chance of doing it because of slavery, because of having to contrast what was said in the white church with what we knew had to be true if God was a God of love and truth and justice, right? But nevertheless, we had songs that were part of the hymn book that we didn't create, as well as the spirituals that we did, right? And I come to the garden alone, you see, and he tells me things that no other person has ever heard, right? Well, I thought, how could that be? You see, is that God's voice booms to the whole world,
right.
And then in the movement, it became clear that we were, in fact, what one of our people called Walker Wyatt T. called it. We were, in fact, the home mission board of the American Christian Church. You see what I mean?
That's good.
Yeah, isn't it good?
The home mission board.
Yeah, because we were actually taking the issues out into the street, the issues of religion, because you see, for Martin, the movement never was a civil rights movement. It was a moral and spiritual movement, right? That was moving civil rights, right? Is that, and he understood the depth of things when he wrote on the window of SCLC in the beginning, to redeem the soul of America,
right.
Is that America had to had to be changed. The very soul of the nation had to be changed, and it's these kind of things that led me step by step, right? Is to begin to see the fact that the church was even thinking about being personal, right? And I love the way that you put it in this personal, private kind of dialogue.
Yeah. Well, what drew me as a 14-year-old kid was this vision of the beloved community, where everybody had a place at the table, and those who had been left out, left behind, had a front row seat. You know, that was the vision. And I was in Detroit, you know, and I was asked, who is this minister named King, and what's he about? And then I finally went in the city and I met the other evangelical church, black churches.
That's good to see.
Read the same Bible, loved the same Jesus, sang out of the same hymn book that made it sound so much better than we did. And I learned there about a holistic vision of faith where changes lives and feeds hungry people and talks about justice. I really think the black churches have held the gospel together better in this nation than any other church. And as you say, the black church hadn't always, all black churches always been on the front lines, and there was a battle in the civil rights movement too about all that. But that's where I learned this holistic vision of the gospel that that links, personal transformation and social justice.
At the Urban Training Center in Chicago, staff there with Jim Morton and et cetera, is that one of the things that stood out is that we put people out on the street on Skid Row. Right? We put them out there for 4 or 5 days with only $6 in their pocket for the entire experience, right? In the middle of Chicago, right? And they would have to go to these various places where those without food had to go to eat, and those without shelter had to go find it, right?
To get their food and shelter.
That's it. That's it. To get their food and shelter, right? And I remember one of the fellows saying is that they even nailed the cup that they poured soup in to the wall, right? Is that he began to understand, as all of them did, that there was a world of difference between how the poor that the Bible talks about at great length all the time were treated, and how that the normal churches, the regular straight-line churches, and the bigger they were and the more important they were, would give money but didn't even know where it went, didn't understand how people were treated at the other end, but could say, oh, well, we're feeding them, and had no connection. Them. The
poor are objects of our concern.
Objects of it. That's a good way of saying it.
But not friends.
Never.
Not friends.
In fact, I'll give you one of the stories, Jim, is that one of the fellows had preached at one of the very important churches in Chicago. He was from another city and had preached in one of them. He was an important person within his denomination. And so while he was out on Skid Row with the old clothes on, and he'd already been out about 3 days, and he was, didn't smell all that good either, he went to one of these churches that he'd preached at, a very important church in the city, and they couldn't believe that it was he, would not let him in the door, would not, they answered the door, they saw him through the door, would not let him in. It awakened him. The whole church needs to have an awakening.
And then it even goes deeper when you get to Matthew 25, because what Jesus is saying there is, I was hungry, I was thirsty, I was naked, I was sick, I was a stranger, I was in prison, and you didn't show up.
That's right.
Lord, when do we see you hungry, thirsty, naked, sick, stranger, in prison? Well, as you've done to the least of these, you've done to me. That was my conversion text. So we had this food line, this early days of Sojourners in Washington, D.C., 20 blocks from the White House. Hundreds of people waiting in line for a bag of groceries, needing a bag of groceries, and run by volunteers who all themselves needed the bag of groceries too. And I would always get back for that on Saturday morning, because just to hear Mary Glover pray, Sister Mary Glover always said the prayer. We had all joined hands, the volunteers, before the people came in. We're all ready for the food, pass it out. And she'd pray, because she was our best prayer. She was an old Pentecostal woman who prayed like she knew to whom she was talking,
That's it.
And she said, Lord, thank you for waking me up this morning. Thank you. The walls of my grave, walls of my room were not the walls of my grave, and my bed was not my cooling board. Thank you, Lord. Then she prayed this prayer. Lord, we know that you'll be coming through this line today. So, Lord, help us to treat you well. That's the best commentary on Matthew 25 I've ever heard,
That's really...
So it isn't just we need to be friends of the poor. Is in the poor, says the text, is the very face of Christ.
In fact, thinking about the political setup, right, is that it seems as though that if you're a Christian, you are there's a third politic going on. There's a politic of the right, politic of the left. There's a politic, there's conservative politics. It's that Christ and culture thing, all right? Is that, and we as Christians have a special politic, it seems, right? Because the way you cut it, I'm really dealing out of your book, right? Is that, and the way you're cutting it is that without seeing that, right, we're missing. And this is why both the right and the left do not get it.
Religion's not meant to be a ideologically predictable and loyally partisan thing, but something that's prophetic, that can critique both left and right, that can cut both ways and go deeper. What's the moral center? Not the political middle, but the moral center for our public life. And we have to be able to, the Bible suggests, it's very uncomfortable for us, but it suggests that the truth about a society is known not from the top down, but from the bottom up. So what's happening in prisons or on the street is the best indicator of the health of a society. The prophets make very clear, they're not subtle about this. They say a nation's righteousness is determined not by its gross national product or its military firepower, but how it treats the poorest and most vulnerable. If there's a litmus test in the Bible, that's it.
Yeah. In fact, and that's the basis of God's politics.
Absolutely.
I remember at the conference in London where that we had the great woman in India, saint of the Catholic Church,
Mother Teresa.
Mother Teresa, and I went to hear her. Because I was thinking that I was going to hear a great theological understanding of what she was doing and why she was doing it, right? She talked about one thing all the time, right? And for 15 minutes, she talked about loving the least of these, the little ones. And you realize that was her politic.
It was. It was. And she said, Christ comes to us, out of that text, she said, Christ comes to us in the distressing disguise of the poor.
And this is your Matthew 25.
Yeah, and that was my conversion text.
Yes, that's it.
What does it mean to take Jesus seriously? When a president says Jesus was my favorite philosopher, or politicians want to invoke his name, oh, we're all Christians. Well, okay, Jesus asked that question in Matthew 25. I'll know how much you love me by how you treat them. And he says, and other things that are hard sayings, blessed are the peacemakers, for they should be called the children of God. Love your enemies. Now, that's a popular text on September 11th, right?
Yeah.
In churches. I don't hear many sermons on that going on in our congregations.
In fact, after the first few days, if you talked about why those buildings were bombed, if you, then you were not patriotic. Remember? The right rose up quickly to say, you're not patriotic. The left remained silent because they were afraid this three-way politic again, right?
Yeah.
In fact, Jim, what is the most important thing, issue, whatever the word is, meaning, that you think that the Christian, whether individual or church, should in fact learn from 9/11?
September 11th was a day where Americans had their illusions shattered. The illusion of invulnerability, that we were safe, we were protected, or ought to be. All of a sudden, we're like the rest of the world. It was an invitation, a teachable moment, I think, to join the rest of the world in its vulnerability. People in Cape Town know vulnerability. Sarajevo, Tel Aviv, San Salvador. In fact, I noted on those days after how the children, the kids in my neighborhood, urban children of color, had a different response than the white suburban middle-class Americans, because they thought it was terrible. But the idea of random violence, intervening at any moment to take away a loved one, was not a new experience for them. They already knew vulnerability.
Yes.
But the white American kind of illusion that we should be protected. And instead of joining the rest of the world, yes, which we could have done at that moment,
that's it,
we just retreated and said, no, take away that vulnerability. Just erase our vulnerability. And the government's been trying to do that. And they say, well, you may have to turn away from some things at Abu Ghraib or wherever. Yeah. You don't want to see what we do to these people. You may have to sacrifice some civil liberties. We're going to spend all of our resources now on security and weapons of war, and we may not have any money for child health care. Mm-hmm. And too many of us say, okay, whatever it takes, just take away my vulnerability. Yeah. And we lost a moment there. I think we can still recapture that, but it's joining the rest of the world in its vulnerability, which is the key.
You know, in this city, Cascade, a major black artery, has some of our major churches on it, right? We all came together and had the only march in this city on the war. We did it immediately after 9/11, immediately, right? Because we'd been thinking about it before, right? Yeah. So when it happened, we were ready to actually march down that street and talk about it in a different way than the public was talking about it, right? And so that we were really trying to find out how should we as Christians react to the fact of 9/11, you see. All right?
But see, right there, when you say how should we as Christians,
yes,
is a different question than how should we just as Americans
that's it.
react.
Talk.
Too many Christians are Americans first.
That's it.
Now, it's I know it sounds controversial, but it's a very biblical thing to say that Christians are meant to be, first of all, part of an international body of Christ, if you will, right, not just American citizens.
Yes.
And around the world, you know, the truth is that every major church body in the world that spoke on the war in Iraq, for example, said the war is wrong. It's not a just war. Right. The only exception were our American Southern Baptist friends.
Yes.
But even most evangelical Christians around the world said the war was wrong. The Pope was against this war.
And remains so.
Very, very steadfastly.
That's right.
So there was a real religious response around the world rising up against this. But here in America, we acted too much like fearful Americans and not as those people who are people of faith.
Yeah. And you know, that brings up this whole thing is once you've started a war, how do you react? As you said, as we missed an important moment.
Yeah, we
did. We reacted with revenge. We must kill somebody, right? And we don't even care to count those we killed and whether they were innocent or not, which we make a big thing of, right? Is that we had to do something out of violence. We had to do something out of revenge. The thing is that, and we picked on a country that hadn't even been involved.
Had no connection to 9/11 at all.
And not at all.
No.
But it made us feel better. Now, you see, here is exactly where the Christian and those that just want to be American and go into institutions where they have a cross on the wall have to at least part company, right? Or at least come to serious dialogue, it seems, right? Is that how do we deal with it now that we're in it? I mean, we talk about having international groups and international ways of getting back again, right? Is that, see, I think the moment that we missed, Jim, is a part of your conversation and part of the book, right? Where you're talking about which I like to call, right, the way I like to think of it, is that this is not a time for the empires of yesterday. This is a moment for the empire of great deeds. Is that this is an empire of to get rid of poverty, which you suggested, right? How would we deal with it? Is the tsunami issue, right? It seems as though that for whatever reason and whatever spin we put on it, right, is that it occurred at a time when we should see a practical example of how the nations could move together.
Yeah.
And they helped 12, I think it was, countries, right, where this had hit. And if we could do that, right?
We rose to the occasion at the tsunami, but we didn't ask, what about that silent tsunami that takes the lives every day of 30,000 children due to hunger, eminently curable diseases, and lack of clean drinking water?
Yes.
You know,
that's right.
What do we do about that everyday tsunami? And I think we could be pulled together around that too.
See, this is most important, is that, and that would be a Christian politic worthy of our innermost being. That would speak to how we then, as Christians, could approach the other politics that go on in the nation, right? And so that we could come out with something. We have had a marvelous time just talking with Jim. I hope you've appreciated as much as I have. But we will be back next week to continue, so that and hopefully in between time you will read some of God's politics and think about how we can get it right as Christians and how we can be evangelical about the central themes of Christian culture and where we can become a part of the historic stream of the Christian church that started in 33 A.D., not just started at the formation of the United States, all right? So that our Christianity can become deep and meaningful and probing. And maybe we too can begin to save the soul and redeem the soul of the most important nation in the world.